Greetings and welcome to Writers on Writing. I am your host, Dr. Brenda Greene, Executive Director of the Center for Black Literature and Director of the National Black Writers Conference. Writers on Writing is a radio show that is paid for by Medgar Evers College. We come to you each week and give you, our listening audience, an opportunity to hear writers talk about their work, their craft, and their lives. And you can also watch us on YouTube at the Center for Black Literature YouTube page, which is centerforblackLiterature.org. I'm very, very pleased to have with me today the writer, Maurice Carlos Ruffin. So welcome, Maurice.
Hello, thank you so much for having me, Doctor. It's good to be here.
You're welcome. And so Maurice Carlos Ruffin is the author of his first book, We Cast a Shadow, which was a finalist for the Faulkner Award, the Pan Open Book Award, and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. And it was also longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. More recently, he is the author of The Ones Who Don't Say They Love You, which was published by One World Random House in August of 2020 and 21. And we're very, very excited. We're going to be zeroing in and focusing on that book of short stories, which are indicative of New Orleans life. Maurice Carlos Ruffin is a New Orleans native, and he is a professor of creative writing at LSU. And also, are you teaching at another university?
Randolph College has an MFA program, so I teach with them in the low-res program.
And you also have a background, I found out, as a trial lawyer. So you just have a really, really interesting background.
That's true. I'd love to have a variety of experience.
Okay. Well, we all have our different journeys. And when you're called, and obviously you've been called to write, you turn to that. And so I was really, really fascinated, as I said, by this book, and wondered how you decided to talk about this book, which really represents the complexity of New Orleans. I don't want to offend anyone, but also kind of the underlife of New Orleans. They're the stories we don't hear. What motivated you to tell these stories?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I appreciate what you said, Doctor, about we're all on a journey in our lives. And I think that the reason I became a writer is because I recognized that I was from an underserved community, but in the way that we often talk about, often if we say that a community is underserved, we're talking about material things, food, shelter. Of course, those things are really important, but every community has stories that need to be told. And while there are many creative people in my city, for the most part, the ones who have some success outside of the city are the musicians. And I just realized that because I had some writing skill, I need to start telling these stories and publishing these stories. If I didn't tell any stories at all, it would be a shame to have these narratives lost. And in particular, I want to tell the stories of people who were being ignored. If you look at the books published out of New Orleans that are considered classics, these were often things by white writers, often white male cisgender writers. Talented people, Tennessee Williams, Faulkner, John Kennedy Toole, and others. But the fact of the matter is that New Orleans is a majority Black city, and it has been pretty much throughout its entire history. And so I want to be a part of that vanguard that is telling stories about our community so that we don't disappear in the face of the earth.
That's right. So you talk about the LGBT community, the impact of drugs, impact of prostitution, even what happens to war, gentrification, the homelessness. And then you also go into the token Black, passing. You just, and your stories all have unexpected endings. So many of them have unexpected endings. So you're making the community, the residents of New Orleans, and actually even the post-Katrina, you're making them visible, very, very visible. One of the things I was drawn to was that I could really empathize with the characters. I could hear them talking. You were able to capture the dialogue and the language. It was so rich. What did you do to accomplish that?
Yeah, it was a long process because even though I'm somebody who has always loved storytelling and I loved to read when I was young, when I had difficulties, my grandmother, who was an English teacher in middle schools, would give me books to read to help me get better at reading. Um, I realized that when you're trying to become a writer, it's a different process. There's training involved. And one of the big questions was how to present my people's voices. New Orleans is a very particular place. Again, we are majority African American. We're Southern, but we're not quite Southern in some ways. And in order to capture those voices and how to describe this? I remember that there was a book by Junot Diaz some years ago where,
yes.
Oscar Wilde, people wonders like Oscar Wilde, people were asking him, why did he not italicize the Spanish parts of the book, or, how was he able to have these parts for these characters who were kind of young and not that well educated, or talk about these very sort of high-flown concepts. And he says, look, this is how we think, is how we live. We don't think in italics. We know things that you don't assume we know. And so in trying to get the voices right, I wanted to have people who sounded New Orleans. We have this mixture of Haitian and French and African and English influences and Native American influences that inform how we sound. And so to capture that was a matter of just listening and hearing their voices in my mind and not being afraid to have that on the page, not considering the reader on the other end thinking, well, this is so weird. Well, New Orleans can be a strange place, and that's part of our charm.
And you said two things I want to go to. You said listening. So where did you listen? Are you one of those writers who sat in the cafe listening and writing, or was it reading that really impacted the kinds of stories you told and what you wanted to stress? I'm asking you two questions. I think about writers who are in conversation with other writers and they're reading other writers to influence them. And then I'm also asking you about your writing process for giving these wonderful, rich stories.
Well, two questions for one answer, really. When I say listening, what I really mean is memory. So many of my characters' voices are the voices of people either in my family or people that I've known in my life. My friends and loved ones, people I went to school with, people that I worked with. And so I might say, just as a concrete example, to do the voice of a kid named Baby in a story called The Pie Man. He's 14 years old. Writing that story is like a 33-year-old man. I'm thinking, okay, how would he sound? Well, not like me, not like me as a trial lawyer. But, I can recall my cousins' voices from 20 years before that. And how would they relate to one another in conversation and bring those voices down? For a character like the one in the novella, Galia, that's like a mixture like my auntie's voice. I think, well, how would they discuss things? How would the thought processes work? So when I say listening, yeah, there is some like being in a cafe and listening, and there is some reading works by contemporaries of people from the past, but a lot of it's just thinking back and that nostalgia. This is how we sound.
So a lot of those stories were were short. They weren't long stories. Is that something you did in one sitting? Is it something you went back to? Were you just relying on your memory? Talk a little bit about that process, your writing process.
Oh, sure. None of the stories in the book are autobiographical, although like most writers, there are elements that come from real life. The flash fiction pieces, I stumbled upon flash fiction maybe around 2010 and fell in love with the form because, we often think about form in poetry, but in fiction, people just kind of say, write a story. I love the idea that you could introduce a character and tell an entire story about them with conflict in 2 or 3 pages. And so many of the flash pieces, so the collection has 19 stories in it, about 6, I think, are flash pieces. And I wrote many of those at one sitting. I just sat down after some coffee and took maybe 20 minutes and wrote out a draft. And then kind of went back to it for a little while and made some adjustments to it. And that was all it really was to it. But I just love the idea that, first of all, again, wanting to tell as many stories as possible. By having flash stories, I could up the quantity of stories in the collection, literally.
That's right. So who is your audience when you're thinking about you're giving the complexity of life in New Orleans? Who is your audience? Is it the general reader? Is it other Black people? What are you thinking about as your audience?
My first audience, so there are many audiences, but my very first audience would probably be young people in their late teens in New Orleans, Black kids. Because I remember being the kind of nerdy kid who would leave high school and volunteer at the library and stumble across these amazing books, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, uh, Sonia Sanchez. I could name people. I read these books and thought, there's so much beauty and information here, things that I'm not being told from television or even from music or from people I trust, but I trust these writers so much. And that inspiration was really the seed to me becoming a writer. So I want young people, first and foremost, to read the books and sort of see, okay, these things are possible, and then make their own stories based on that. And then for the Black community, that's the next level. It's just that, I think that so much of what America is, despite the good parts, is suppressing our stories. And I see myself as a part of a very large chorus, and large in terms of like it's with and going back through time and going into the future. I'm just one voice. And then just, for anybody who loves good stories, that could be anybody anywhere in the world. I can imagine some person in Latvia getting my book online and reading it, in a couple of days and kind of going, all right, that was very nice. So many audiences, but also myself. I just want to please myself with stories. If I'm not proud of a story, it doesn't get published. And I get great joy from writing.
Okay, when did you start writing?
Well, I think like a lot of writers, I was, writing in a personal journal when I was a kid, or, if a teacher made the students in 7th grade write themes and getting singled out as, oh, this is pretty good writing, you should present to the class, those kinds of things. I think like many writers, I didn't really accept the title of writer until I was a bit older. I think that for writers, that label of writing is a sacred thing. So I didn't accept it until I was in my 30s. And that was a process of joining writing groups, taking independent classes, going back to grad school, working to publish stories, and then finally going, okay, you deserve this title now because you've done the work to own it.
Okay. So you're going to be on a panel called Nobody Knows My Name, Race Relations in Black Literature, which was inspired by James Baldwin's collections of essays and his that focus on the artist in this society, the role of the writer, the role of the artist. Also talks about what's happening in our society, our culture, American democracy, and then relationships among different genders. So when you think about the stories you've told, just reflect on that. The whole concept of Nobody Knows My Name. You addressed it previously when you talked about making people more visible. But what else can you say about race relations and democracy in America? How do your stories help us to understand that more deeply?
Well, I'll give you sort of a popular example that I've been thinking about recently. You look at the top grossing films of the past, well, really, I think just about of all time, there's two. Adjusted for Inflation, the top film of all time, money-wise, Gone with the Wind. So that is a quote-unquote classic film that is about slavery, but treats the slaves as if they are beloved ones. And of course, the main characters are the white characters who, own the slaves and are fighting to continue slavery's influence into the future. And then in the modern era, the biggest films are films like the Marvel Comics film, with the Avengers and Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man and that kind of thing. And I think about how in both of those contexts, you never get the points of view of the Black characters. They're always sort of either side characters or literal sidekicks. Iron Man has a buddy named War Machine, who's a black guy in a big metal uniform, and he sort of follows orders from Iron Man. And I just think that a big part of the American experiment is this sort of tug of war between what we that everybody is a person now, supposedly. I hope so. But then we say in terms of like who's important and whose stories counts, it's usually a white guy. But I also marvel at the fact that that's never stopped us. That's never stopped Toni Morrison. That's never stopped Ralph Ellison. Never stopped James Baldwin. It didn't stop Jay-Z and Beyonce, and it's not stopping me either. And so that tension and that push-pull to me is a essential part of our experience. And the fact that despite all the barriers that have been placed in front of us, we continue to create some of the greatest art in human history is inspirational for me. And it's the reason why I don't get too down on the situation there. We are able to maintain ourselves and create beauty and wonder despite the limitations of society.
Right. That gives the essence of the conference we're hosting, The Beautiful Struggle, Black Writers Lighting the Way. And your stories definitely speak to that. What were the stories that really captured you? I know that, I had several that, and they were very varied. Your story, Rhinoceros, about the Black Lives Matter movement, Ghetto University, I could relate to. How many people are who have their PhDs, and you think the PhD is going to guarantee you success, and it doesn't. Token, I could relate to. I mean, so what captivated you? What were the highlights of those stories? And you really said, I have to tell this.
Well, I think I'm the kind of writer who, in some ways, like a lot of creators, I create from an obsession. I get an idea in my head and I just can't stop thinking about it. So when each of those stories was written, I was obsessed with that idea at that time. So maybe the later ones kind of shine a little bit brighter in my mind. You mentioned Rhinoceros, for example. I kept thinking about which stories had I not told so far in my own writing life. And that story is about a transgender girl and a non-binary young person who have just finished high school, just as the George Floyd protests in New Orleans are starting. And they're trying to figure out who they are, how they fit in, both in their sort of personal relationships, but also in the wider picture, in the sort of American picture. And so I was just really thrilled by that opportunity to tell those stories. And it's funny because we're in an era in which we're reassessing who gets to tell which stories, which I think is an important reassessment. I don't consider myself to be queer, but I also think about the fact that so many of my loved ones are queer. And so you say, well, how do you tell that story? Well, I go, okay, how would my cousin speak on these issues? What things have they faced in their life? What do they want people to know about them? What do they hold dear? What are they afraid of? And what do they really want to have said out loud? So those characters for me are doing those things. So I love that story. I mentioned the one called Before I Let Go, which is a novella. I thought I want a middle-aged Black woman to have her own story, and not only her own story, but the longest story. It's 39 pages long.
Yes, that was one of my favorites.
Yeah, thank you. But she's a mother. She's gay, and she's facing what so many of us in the city have faced, which is gentrification and being forced out of the city that birthed us. So, those two in particular I think about a lot. But then also, Gale University, you mentioned that as well, which is very dear to my heart because it's satire and it's farce, but it's also very authentic, I think.
That's right. That's right. And so when you and of course the story was very moving. Your opening, the ones who don't say they love you. So all of your work is really about that search for love and the need to be loved. And I was thinking about we recently lost Bell Hooks, and she really spoke very often about that in her last books around the need for love and what love means. What would you reflect on that, on the title and on that opening, the story, the fact that so many times the writing we do really is about a search for love?
Yeah, Bell Hooks. I mean, losing Bell Hooks, I'm not even sure where to start. It's a friend of mine, Robert Jones Jr., he's the author of The Prophets, posted my book today on a post. And I was kind of surprised because, only a few of the stories have a sort of traditional romantic component to them. It was talking about love in the face of loss. And I think with Bell Hooks in particular, there's this African proverb that when a person dies, a library is lost. But with somebody like Bell Hooks, I feel like a continent is lost. She was the great explorer of love. And that applies in certain ways to people like Lucille Clifton and perhaps Alice Walker and Toni Morrison and others. I think for me as a writer, I'm constantly trying to figure out the shape and the size and the colors of love. How does it work? What does it mean? And why are we also attracted to it? We obviously need it as human beings. And so for some of my characters, they've had it and lost it. For some, they haven't even touched it yet and they're trying to get close to it. But I think for all of them, they're questioning what that means. That's really what ties together the various stories in the collection, this quest for love.
Yes, yes. So when you think about these were your short stories, this is getting good reviews. What are your next projects?
Quite a few projects. There's some things that are kind of farther out right now, which is I'm working on a writing craft book that I'm very excited about. I'm working on a poetry collection that I'm very excited about. And then I have a massive book that's getting so big, I may wind up publishing it in 3 parts because I can't publish a 1,200-page book, I don't think, probably not. So there's one scenario in which I will publish a book probably within the next 18 months that is set in about an enslaved Black girl and her mother in New Orleans. And to me, that book is important because we get a lot of these narratives that we see in film and in books too, which looks at Black folks in a certain time, particularly in the South, a certain way. New Orleans had a huge free population. And even the enslaved people's lives were not like what you would expect because it was urban, it wasn't rural. So this book is very much about those sort of interactions and how if you were born as a slave in New Orleans in 1840, for example, your life would look very unexpected. We haven't really seen those narratives before.
Historical fiction is something that we're seeing so much of, and moving forward. And so you are a teacher. Talk to us about the message you have for your students, how you get your students to really engage in writing.
Yeah, the first message is a little unexpected. I always iterate and reiterate the idea of joy in writing. One thing, have a good time. I think that many writers get lost because they see it as a grueling task, then they get discouraged and they just stop writing. But beyond that, I'm trying to encourage my students to write stories that are both authentic and they bring a certain news of the world. In other words, writers who are starting out often want to follow fads. They see television shows like a Game of Thrones or a film like Black Panther and say, I can do that. And that's all fine to start out with. But they have to go into their own lives and their own hearts and tell stories that are true to them, even if it's all made up. And I think that if I'm working well as a professor, I'm giving them that encouragement and that belief that they can be courageous and tell stories that are their experiences, even if they're entirely fiction.
And just related to that, telling authentic stories, true stories, how important is the craft? Because as you said, there's so many people say, I could write that. How do you talk to them about craft and what do you say?
Yeah, craft is everything. Craft is everything because, a certain level of competence is really important. And so I make it a point in my classes to go over the fundamentals, things like narrative arcs or deciding which point of view to consider. We cover essays by writers talking about craft. I have books that I recommend on things like plot, for example. And I have to say that most of the students are very good. I think that nowadays, because people are exposed to so many stories constantly, whether it's on a streaming service like HBO Max or whether they're on Twitter, stories are so ubiquitous. There's actually less work and you have to explain some basics. More, you sort of, push them in a certain direction and say, have you thought about this? Try to think about this in your revision and lean towards that. And it tends to work out pretty well.
Okay, well, I really want to thank you. It's been really a wonderful conversation. I have been speaking with Maurice Carlos Ruffin, the author of The Ones Who Don't Say They Love You. These stories are really fascinating, and he is making visible those voices that are often silenced or not even heard. So I thank you for sharing that with us. I thank you for educating all of us. And I thank you for your devotion to your craft, and bringing it all together. And you've been listening to Writers on Writing. I always say, empower yourselves as readers and writers. The writer is always reading, the reader is always writing. And this broadcast has been paid for by Medgar Evers College Radio. So thank you again, Maurice. Thank you for the work you do.
Dr. Greene, thank you so much.
Okay, all right.